yesterday, just by coincidence, I went to see Jane Rayner. Nothing to do with this, but I was arranging another session. And amongst other things, she gave me some of the things from John. And it was an old liberal Jewish news. And I noted it was, let's celebrate the 100th year of liberal Judaism. How quickly the time flies. And here we are just beginning. And I think this is the first activity of the 120th anniversary. And I know that so many activities are being planned for this year. And we have every right to celebrate, not just our existence, but in fact that we're thriving. Even though we've been through difficult times, our movement is thriving. And it seems a good time to start by looking back at some of our key people who've got us to this point. And as it's the first time event, let's say a Shechehianu. Let's just thank God that we are all here and that we can gather on Zoom to hear the first, and how fitting it is. It should be dedicated to John Rayner. And so let's say together, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, shechianu v'kiyamanu v'higianu lazman hazeh. And now it gives me great pleasure to hand over to David Lippman up there in Nottingham.
Hello, thank you, Andrew. Good evening, all. Yes, I think the first thing I'd like to say is it is not really a commendation for Charles, rather a commendation for me, is to say that we've been personal friends for a long time, for 30 years or so. And we've been on holiday together with our late wives. So I know he is well used to dealing with difficult congregants. Is he not, after all, a fellow of the Zoological Society of London with a particular interest in tigers? Where to start? Well, I think really from his ordination at the college in 1986, having completed a BA and a PhD in Aramaic studies in UCL, and then he was involved with Andrew in various ULPS and LJ Sidurim and Machzorim and other books with Andrew. And picking out from his CV, he was for a time visiting alternate weekends at Dublin and Cardiff synagogues, the one progressive in Dublin and the other in Cardiff Reform. And I note also in particular in relation to Dublin that he was a visiting lecturer in interfaith studies at the Irish School of Ecumenics at Trinity College, Dublin. And from there, he crossed the Irish Sea and the North Sea to get to Denmark, where he was the founder rabbi of the first progressive congregation in that country. He was executive director of ULPS, as it was then, from 1997 to 2002. And so he has, I don't think it's fair to apply the word checkered to his history, varied and geographically challenged on occasion, perhaps. But where else to go? Well, I think the next place to go is for his personal interests, his interest in classical music, in bird watching, in wildlife photography, in writing poetry. And I'm a reasonably frequent attender at the RSC in Stratford, so I've heard other poets as well. And without intending any disrespect to Charles at all, I do find the poetry of Shakespeare of somewhat deeper and more cogent. And
that's outrageous, outrageous.
I have read his poetry, and if not quite up to Stratford standards, it ain't half damn bad. I wonder if I dare end with a recollection myself of John Rayner. I had held various offices in ULPS, including the chair, and outside the US in the European region. But it was only when we were at a European region conference in Paris, he and Jane and Ray and I were on a bateau on the River Seine one evening. It was only when John told me a slightly risque story that I felt that I had arrived at last. I was really there. And of course, being John, it was only very slightly risque. But at that point, and not wishing to take more time from Charles, it gives me huge pleasure to be able to introduce Rabbi Dr. Charles Middleburgh, not least because he's talking about a hero of mine, Rabbi Dr. John Rayner.
Thank you, David, for that. It's said with love as always, and as I'm on Zoom, no one can see how much I'm blushing. When Leah Mulstein approached me and asked me to take this session, I agreed immediately on the grounds that any opportunity to talk about my mentor and revered teacher and much, much loved friend is a joy to me. And it was only when Tom sent me round the list of attendees and I saw who were attending tonight. I can't see you all now, which is probably just as well. There are those here who knew John far, far longer than me, and I'm not obviously talking about Jane, but many others, particularly from the LJS. And so I decided that the safest thing for me to do was to give a personal recollection and perhaps a little anecdotal. And when Leah asked me for a title and I said a loving retrospective, the most important word there is loving. When you saw John on the bima at the LJS, whether it was the old LJS that some of us remember, or whether it was the new LJS, he was an awesome figure. Some of you will recollect a black and white photo of John standing at the desk of in the new sanctuary, as it was then, and the camera is slightly below him and looking up. And I've looked at that photo, which I have a copy of at home many, many times, and I don't think that even Moses himself could have looked more awe-inspiring than John in that pulpit. But there was a great deal more, of course, to John Rayner close up than from a distance. From a distance, he was deeply spiritual, incredibly knowledgeable teacher and rabbi. Close up, he was those things too, but he was also a friend, and a very good friend for people he cared for. And so among my anecdotes, and I looked through some of the things that I had written about John after he died. And one of the things that I said was talking about John as a teacher and saying that he was incredibly caring with his students, even when, especially when, we were studying Shulchan Aruch with him and we didn't necessarily read the text correctly. He never ever made anybody feel overpowered or embarrassed. He was in that regard the very best sort of teacher. I think it would be inappropriate to suggest that John was reluctant to show his emotions because he was a man of rich emotion. And I can recall one or two occasions when I would have said of anybody else, we had to scrape him off the wall. But I will simply say with John that for those who knew him, you recognize that he was getting very steamed up. I recall a particular meeting at the Israeli embassy when that happened. And even more so do I recall that happening at a rabbinic conference meeting, and I was chair of the rabbinic conference as it then was. And we had Jeffrey Paul and the prior owner of Andrew's number plate attending. And the Mayor Persoff made a very ill-judged remark, something akin to Daniel asking the lions whether they were hungry. And I have to say that although steam didn't literally come out of John's ears, it was definitely there. And those of us sitting close to him, as I was then, could almost feel the waves. But nevertheless, impeccably polite as he always was, he did not do what others would certainly have done. And that was to get involved perhaps with one of the speaker's jugulars. Sitting at rabbinic conference meetings with John was always interesting. So those were the days, as Andrew and I recall, of the giants. Apart from Andrew himself, Frank Hellner, David Goldberg, Sidney Brichto, and John himself. And if there was an issue which engaged all of them, and perhaps which they disagreed on, holding the meeting together was a lot more challenging than many people would realize. John made a huge contribution, of course, to liberal Judaism and indeed world progressive Judaism through the liturgies, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. But he wrote many other things, many other pamphlets and essays, and monographs, and so on. And I recall when the work started to produce a statement of liberal Jewish ethics, and I still think that text stands as a great testimonial to John, the man and the rabbi. And I invited the aforementioned great and the good to come to my home in Pinner, and we sat around the dining table and tried to get the project underway. And all I can say is it was absolutely fascinating from an anthropological point of view. Jane Goodall herself could not have been more engaged by observing the different reactions of the rabbis around the table, who spoke, who waited, who grimaced, and so on. I have to say, John did not grimace. I never saw him do that in response to something that another person had said. Of course, as I mentioned a moment ago, what so many people know about John, and I'm talking about those who never met him, is his involvement with the creation of the liturgies that we use in liberal Judaism, Siddur Lev Chadash and Machzor Ruach Chadasha. And Andrew and I had the immense privilege of being part of the process of creating Siddur Lev Chadash with John, with Albert and Alex Wright, and latterly David Goldberg and Peter Bias, but principally the first four of us. We did it delightfully. I found some old pictures the other day, Andrew, which I will show you one day. We used to go to a farm at a place called Hinton in the Hedges. There was an old RAF airfield there. And we used to spend a concentrated 2 or 3 days working gradually through preparing the text for Siddur Lev Chadash. And it was incredible watching John work, not only for the breadth of his knowledge, but also for the systematic way he set everything out for us. So for example, when we first started and we were looking at the very first service, John had created a line-by-line document of whatever prayers we were looking at in all of the different Siddurim in which they occur. All those papers, those precious papers, now reside in the Leo Beck College Library. John had an incredible feel for the English language, I suppose as one who had been born somewhere else can have. He was an English stylist. His writing had a lyrical quality to it, a real beauty and an intrinsic poetry. And I was regularly, and I suspect I was not alone, sort of rocked back in the best sort of way in my seat by some of the things that he produced. Really, there are certain prayers in our liturgy that I don't think could be bettered by anybody, and they were all written by him. Of course, when Andrew and I stepped up to the plate to co-edit Mahzor Ruach Hadasha, we sort of bolstered each other's confidence, but we had John Rayner and Eric Friedland as well as our, I think we called them liturgical advisors. And there was one memorable occasion when Eric Friedland, who was American, flew in, and he and John and Andrew and I sat at the Goldstein dining table for a session on the Mahzor, which really then turned into an exchange between the two liturgical giants. And Andrew and I have said many times before, we felt like the little boys in the middle while these two titans talked and stimulated each other and each other's scholarship. And there was a very loving bond there between those two, and it was wonderful to be part of it. Now, one thing that any one of my vintage or older will not forgive me for not mentioning is that one of the things that I remember most fondly is what happened when you sent John a piece of writing. Or sorry, let me rephrase that. What happened when I sent John a piece of writing? Because probably nobody else ever sort of experienced what I did. And just in case anyone is thinking it's something terrible, it absolutely wasn't. I would send John something that I'd written that I wanted his opinion of, or something I was pleased with that I wanted him to have. And being a man of meticulous civility, he would always write a thank you letter. So yes, that gives you an idea of the time I'm talking about. And I knew we all did, if we submitted a piece of work to John, we would get a written thank you. Depending on how long the piece of writing that we had sent him would depend on how long the thank you was, because the thank you would occupy the first 3 paragraphs. And then John, in his meticulous way, would forensically go through the rest of the article and make some suggestions about things that could be added, how it could be rephrased, and so on and so forth. Those colleagues I can't see who had that experience and who are smiling will know exactly what I'm talking about. It was always, there was a slightly tense time until you got the letter back and you could sit down and read it. But of course, it was always meant in the most positive spirit of making anything that we did, particularly for the ULPS as it then was, as good as it could possibly be. Now, in October of 2005, we had a sort of day of thanksgiving for John's life at the LJS, and there were many reminiscences and many speakers. I can't now recall them all, but Andrew and I spoke, as did Eric Friedland, who had again come over specially from America, but so did the then Bishop of Oxford, Richard Harris, because of course, as some know, when John came over from Germany before the war, he was placed ultimately with a very special Christian clergy family who had great influence on him. And so all the many facets of John were addressed, including, of course, his views on Israel, which were always honorable, but sometimes very controversial. I do recall being at an AGM at the LJS when, well, I won't say who was president and chair at the time, but effectively when after John had made some remarks, one or the other of them said, we believe very much in the sanctity of the pulpit and the rabbi's right to express their own opinions. We just wish they wouldn't do it so much. And John, with not a flicker, stood up and thanked the person who had made the remarks and said, I'm sure it was said with the utmost sincerity, as indeed were the words spoken by the high priest at Bethel when he told Amos to go home. And that is undoubtedly the most eloquent put down I have ever heard. It was quite delicious, and it remains so. Now, one of the things that I do at Leobeck College is teach liturgy. I teach students in their second year about the evolution of British liturgies, both in the Reform and in the Liberal movements. And all my students can get to know John through memories that I have of particular things as we're going through the texts. But in one of the other liturgy classes that I take with my friend, Professor Jeremy Schonfield, I look at material from Germany. A lot of it is cited in a book by Jacob Petachowski called Prayer Book Reform in Europe. And it just so happens that I have in front of me now John's review of Petachowski's book, which came out, I think, in 1968. And this is just wonderful stuff. It's erudite, it's detailed, but there are a few tiny niggles. I remember talking to John about writing book reviews when I decided I didn't like the book very much, and my option was basically to take the coward's way out. John would never have done that. He always found a way to frame his words. So Petachowski, who also reviewed Service of the Heart, another text that we look at in that class, there was a healthy exchange between the two of them. And I just want to quote to you as an example from John's review where let's say things get a little bit tense. On the whole, he writes, Dr. Petuchowski treats his subject matter with admirable objectivity. Only rarely does he reveal his personal likes and dislikes. One instance is his repeated allusions with obvious disapproval to the late Rabbi Israel Mattock's arbitrary rearrangement of the sequence of prayers. Though he concedes that it was necessary to assert the right of a modern Jewish congregation to break through the rigidity of the established pattern, yet he exaggerates the extent of the rearrangement and pays scant attention to other aspects of Rabbi Mattock's liturgical work. Again, it is evident that Dr. Petuchowski's personal attitude to the matter of textual amendments on doctrinal grounds is extremely conservative. And this goes on for a little bit more. And then we get to the final paragraph. With this major reservation, brackets, and one or two minor ones which will be communicated privately to the author, close brackets, Dr. Petuchowski's book deserves the highest praise and a wide readership. It is painstakingly thorough, brilliantly lucid, original, authoritative, and definitive, a model for future studies in the field. And that is both an example of John's integrity and his Menschlichkeit. But I have to say, I can't read those words without smiling in memory. Now, John's ordination sermon given at the LJS on the 21st of June, 1953, was entitled The Task of Liberal Judaism. So between 1953 and 2022, a lot has happened. And I just want to share with you the final paragraph, which, well, you can decide, but for me, it's pretty timeless. In an age of materialism, John wrote, we must proclaim the supremacy of the spiritual. In an age of irrationalism, reason. In an age of skepticism, faith. In an age of despair, hope. In an age of arrogance, humility. In an age of hatred, love. In an age of strife, peace. In an age of nationalism, universalism. In an age of authoritarianism, the possibility and the grandeur of liberal faith. That, as it appears to me, is the task which faces liberal Judaism in the second half of the 20th century. And I think if that had been written last weekend, it couldn't be more apposite. Now, I'm going to stop in a moment or two because you don't want to listen to me rabbiting on for ages and ages and ages. But I do want to just share a couple of things that were very much inspired by John. I consider it the greatest privilege of both my personal and professional life to have been able to enjoy a relationship of real closeness with John, someone I loved when he was alive and love in just the same way even now. He has had the greatest influence on me, and only one other rabbi holds a similar place in both my affection and regard, and that is the current president of liberal Judaism. But I have personal reasons for being very grateful to John. John officiated at Gilly's and my wedding in the old LJS, and in his inimitable way, he finished with a final blessing in Hebrew, which he had written, which embodied both our Hebrew names. He gave me smicha at the old LJS, and out of concern for my father, who was then registered blind, he spoke his private words to me aloud, so that my family could hear them. And something, again, that says so much about him and his compassion. And then just over a year later, John came down to Hove and conducted my father's funeral and gave great comfort to my mother and myself at a very, very difficult time. So I wrote one paragraph of tribute to him after his death. And try as I might, I haven't been able to find where it was published, but I just want to read it to you as a way of conclusion. John Rayner was a giant of liberal Judaism, a luminary as great as the three M's. His place in their august company is assured for eternity as we contemplate a world impoverished without him, his intellect, clarity, compassion, and integrity. As a teacher, John was a non-pareil, for in spite of his enormous knowledge and the awe engendered by his persona and reputation, his first and last goal was to encourage and educate and never to intimidate his students. Liberal Judaism has been truly blessed for nearly 60 years by the presence of a rabbi whose legacy is enormous, not least in the liturgies he produced with Rabbi Chaim Stern and others, which influenced the non-Orthodox world, and the collections of sermons and addresses, which demonstrate his acuity and breadth of vision. Never shy of controversy where he felt strongly, John was also able to build consensus when necessary, and with his enormous moral authority to drive it through. The greatest privilege of my life, beyond question, is to have enjoyed an exceptionally close and loving relationship with him for nearly 30 years. John was my teacher, mentor, and counselor, and he remains and will always be my role model and guide. The greatest blessing that we all share is to have been fortunate enough to live while he lived and to have shared in something of his precious life. We shall not see his rabbinic like again. Zecher Tzadik Livracha. Thank you.
Charles, thank you so much. When you recited the words of John at his ordination service, I reflected that few rabbis could match the incredible, eloquent articulation of his times, and as you say, quite a universal situation in such an incredible way. Well, you have certainly provided us with eloquent articulation of John's life and meaning as well through this evening. Thank you so very, very much. It's now an opportunity for us to ask questions of Charles. As I said at the beginning, if you're able to keep them to a sentence, that would be really helpful. We'll have plenty of opportunities during this 120th year to reminisce ourselves. But right now is the opportunity to ask Charles some questions. If you find at the bottom of your screen, probably at the bottom, a button which says reactions, you should be able to raise your hand, which will be the easiest way for us to be able to respond. I just wanted to kick things off. Thank you very much indeed. I don't need to kick things off because we've got such a wonderful participative group here tonight. So Paul Hyams, I think, is the first person who would like to ask a question. Paul, over to you.
There we go. Yeah, that was a little bit of a mistake, actually, Rabbi Aaron. But I'd just like to say thank you for what a wonderful presentation. And although I never met Rabbi John Rayner, I feel as though I know him very well. And obviously, he was immensely revered, and his work for the liberal Jewish movement is unquestionably supreme. Thank you very
Paul.
much.
Thank you so much indeed. Jeff Wilson, I'm just wondering, as a next door neighbour of John's in Creekwood, I just wondered if there was something that might have occurred to you whilst Charles was speaking. And also colleagues as well, if you have some questions or that you might like to pose to Charles, please don't be backwards in coming forwards. We rarely are, but I know that it was such a beautiful articulation of John's life and meaning that we may find a little bit, but Rabbi Leah is going to kick us off, I think.
Well, if nobody else comes in first, I'll ask. It's maybe an unfair question, Charles. What would have been John's favorite prayer in Siddur Lev Chadash, do you think?
Well, it's not an unfair question. It is quite a challenging one. I can give you an answer that is slightly broader. Towards the end of John's life, on one of my regular visits to him, I did a sort of interview which covered many areas, and some of them very personal, to do with his childhood. But right near the end, I said to him, is there a piece of liturgy that you wrote of which you would say that you felt proud to have authored it? And very quickly, he answered and said that it was the text of the personal meditation on Yom Kippur morning, which was in Gate of Repentance for the first time, and it's still in Machzor Ruach Hadasha, that he felt best expressed his essence as a liturgist.
Thank you so much. I think it's going to be the rabbis asking questions tonight, unless I do hope others will pitch in with a few questions as well.
Angela
Please.
had her hand up as
Angela
well.
did. Thank you so much. Angela, you just need to turn your mute off.
You mentioned at the beginning that there have been a number of changes since the 1950s. Would you mind, is it possible to very briefly refer to the major ones and also comment on what John's position was vis-a-vis those changes?
Forgive me, I'm a little bit puzzled. Can you be a bit more specific when you talk about changes since the 1950s? I mean, one of the biggest changes.
I'm quoting you in that you referred to there've been a number of changes. So okay. I suppose I'm talking about changes in terms of the direction that liberal Judaism was taking.
Well, thank you. I suppose I should say that one of the big changes in the 1950s was that actually I was born in 1956 and Liabeck College was founded in 1956. So that was quite significant, well, for my parents at least, and for all of us where the college is concerned. I think that there was an intellectual certainty and rigor about the first 50 years of liberal Judaism. And I think that one of the greatest things that John Rayner did was that he reopened the minds of liberal Judaism towards spiritual opportunity. He was willing to look at various positions that had been taken and to assess them quite forensically in the light of where people were at that time, whenever that time was, and where we were now. And he wrote that there should not be any closed liberal minds to Jewish traditional, small t traditional Jewish ritual, which had spiritual worth to it and which could affect someone in a positive way. And that, I think, was one of the many significant things he did. But if I may, I'm sort of leaping forward in time from where you started. Another thing I think that says so much about John as a man was the whole issue of gender inclusive language. And very briefly, a gender inclusive language was first raised with a number of us by our then quite small number, now happily large number, but then small number of women colleagues. And it made certain representations to him about what we needed to do with the new prayer book. And John, again, as he always did, applied his mind to this, even though this was a time when the phrase political correctness gone mad and rabid feminism and things like that were common currency among those who felt intimidated by the idea of women being equal to men in all sorts of ways. And when John had done his thinking, he became the fiercest champion of that cause. You know, there was no woman rabbi who could have defended the principle more than he did. And I would like to think that one of the reasons why our liturgies have worked and have continued to work over the last 40 years is because he had the ability to embrace what were originally, possibly might be said to be, minority views. And because of his recognition of their importance and universality, bring them with the full weight of his authority to a wider audience.
Thank you very much for that, Angela, and others who are around. If you help me, we've got so many people here to see if people are raising hands with questions. I don't think I've got any.
Susie's coming up.
Thank you. Susie.
It's not a question, it's just personal recollection. John married Timothy and me, but he also came to our house to do baby blessings with little gifts for us. He was incredibly humane. And he also came to dinner once or twice. And there was one time, famous time, when we also had David Benedictus to dinner at the same time. And David tried to levitate John, and John was not at all pleased with that. It's this personal recollection of John, who really became a family friend.
Thank you so much, Susie. I think that
so wonderful and so humane.
We are definitely going to have to set up a forum for people to provide their own personal recollections, most especially. But Charles, do you want to just
just one thing that quite extraordinarily, considering what's going on around my feet at the moment, that I didn't mention, another bond that John and I had is that he was an animal lover, both dogs and cats. And if you went to his home, you had the great pleasure of meeting them. I remember some of the cats, but I remember Jessie very, very well. And the two West Highland Terriers that he had, I think either very close to or just after his retirement, who were called Sasson and Simcha. And I always used to ask him which was which, because I couldn't work it out, but he always did. And whenever he came to our house, it was not long before he was on the ground with our dogs, playing with them. That I wouldn't want that to pass without being said.
Thank you indeed for doing so. Charles, I just wondered as well whether there are aspects of John's background which you feel, or John articulated, influenced his thinking, either in liturgy, but also perhaps in terms of the ethics, work of ethics that he produced, which is still very much firmly on my bookshelf and probably on all of our clergy's bookshelves as such a guide and inspiration.
Well, I think, you know, one can't overestimate the influence of the writings, particularly of Claude Montefiore. The idea of ethical monotheism was one that I think I can say John embraced wholeheartedly. And that remains, I think that remains one of the most significant things, that so often you have ideologues who leave a legacy of writing, but the following generations are kind of poorer in comparison and tend not to take it further. whereas as anyone who reads his collections of sermons will know, John did all his writing life see ethical monotheism as the core of liberal Judaism, if it were to be worthy of its history and its heritage. So I think that's probably the main thing, Aaron, just to save some time for other people.
Thank you. Please do wave your hands at us as well if you wish to answer a question but can't quite find the button. If we don't have any more questions, which is perfectly fine, and Charles has been wonderfully. Thank you very much indeed, Dad.
You're muted, Aaron, Andrew.
I don't want to. There's so much that one actually could say and add. I think that, you know, I came from Birmingham and down as a young boy almost, and John was initially, one thought he was an austere god. He was gay, but very soon you got to know someone who's a very human being. And I wouldn't like this evening to go without reminiscing of two other sides of his nature. He was great fun. I remember some of our rabbinic kalot when we were away, and also some of the ULPS conferences. John could do a number of things. First of all, he could do wonderful handstands. And I remember him entertaining people by sort of incredibly strong. You just wouldn't believe it. And suddenly, and I think even when young Aaron was a baby, he would be entertaining Aaron, crawling under the table after him and so on. The other thing was he could tell a great joke. He could remember jokes and he could tell jokes and he could tell them brilliantly. And he could write parodies. He could write humorous talks based on sort of classical poems and all the rest of it. He was a great entertainer, and often people didn't see this side of him, but he was, as I say, he could just be fun to be with. And I think for me, that's the side I on top of all of his, the great things you've talked about, I'd like to remember him as someone who was very warm and somebody who could be great fun to be with. And I remember you talked about those days away that we spent at the airfield. I mean, he'd bring some great bottles of wine as well. He knew his food, he knew his wine, it was just great company to be with. And as somebody said, I really think we ought to put him alongside. We keep make saints out of the 3 M's. Well, I don't know about a saint, but I think somehow or other we should find a way to put JDR amongst the 3 M's.
Absolutely, and I think also you can't not mention the fact that John also loved to sing. Yeah. And I have very fond memories of having been to usually give a sermon at the LJS, and my late wife Chili and I would go back to lunch with John and Jane in Armitage Road, and Birkat Amazon, as led by John, was always a delight. And I'm sure, Jane, you remember as fondly as I do, sitting there with a beatific gritted teeth while John told a joke that you had heard many, many times before. And Andrew is absolutely right. If you missed the humor, you missed something really essential to his nature. And lovely to see you there, Jane.
Thank you. And let's go over to Oxford. Tony, lovely to see you.
You need to unmute.
Hopefully you can hear me now. This is a real question. I just had a look at the Wikipedia entry for John. I did know him quite well, but from a different generation. And I saw that he was born in 1924 and that he left Germany in 1939. So he was living in Germany to the age of 15. I mean, to what extent was his sort of almost Haider teaching, but, you know, where did he learn his the insights of progressive Judaism? Were there eminent liberal rabbis that he was learning from in Germany? Where did his knowledge formulate?
Well, Tony, I'm going to give you a partial answer, which I hope you will understand and accept. When I was thinking about what I was going to do this evening, I decided that I wouldn't do a sort of chronological presentation, simply because that information is available. John very sensibly wrote a memoir of those early years called Before I Forget. And I'm sure a number of us have copies which do give a lot of detail about his life in Germany. And you know, as all of us I'm sure can understand, when we talk about a Jew who was born in the late 20s in Germany and left in 1939 on the Kindertransport, we know that there is a rich story there. But I think that it's much better to read his words about that time than any little bits and pieces that I might choose to mention.
Thank you, Charles. And David, if you want to unmute yourself, David Lippman.
Yes, following on from what Andrew was saying, he also had a great sense of the ridiculous, which I discovered in one incident that I don't think it's, you know, you don't want additions to Charles's now, so it'll wait until you will put on. But Charles, I wonder if you can answer this. He had the most meticulous use of the English language of anyone I knew. I wonder if that had anything to do with his first language for 15 years or so, having been German, and then his transfer, or do you have any views about that?
Well, we always used to say that John Rayner both spoke and wrote English better than anybody else we knew, as we used to say, and just in case anyone thinks that this is lèse majesté from a distance, did actually say it to him as well, that only someone born in Germany who had taken on English as a second language could speak English better than the English. But I think there was something more to it than that. John loved language, not just English language, German language, but he was a devotee of fine writing, and I think one of the reasons why his own writing was so superb, but also particularly where his liturgy writing, which has to have so much more than just English style, it has to have a sense of the spirit and of poetry and so on. He seemed to do that effortlessly, and of course his voice was mellifluous and powerful and gentle at the same time. So I think he was just a lover of language, and he believed that it was important, if you were to make much of a language, that you had to understand it. And I can remember some of the conversations that we had at prayer book retreats when John started talking about English grammar, and Andrew and I looked at each other and sort of shrugged as if to say, what's he talking about?
The generations still do that with others with a German background, hey Leah? Um, um, in just a moment, I'm going to hand back to conclude. I just want to say to everybody, it's wonderful to see so many fantastic faces here tonight. Even though we can't necessarily all come together in one place and just celebrate the kickoff of our 120th year of liberal Judaism. What a fantastic set of screens and faces really to be able to behold here tonight. Thank you also very much for being here. And we look forward to seeing you next week as well, where Rabbi Pete Tobias will be speaking about Rosita Rosenberg. But Dad.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Charles for the various mentions of me. It was meant to be about John Rayner and not about me, but there you go. I feel very privileged that Charles and I worked with John so many times. If I can just add one reminiscence before I end, and that is probably about 30 years ago, somebody in the congregation at what was then Northwood and Pinnacle Synagogue had died, and I'd remember that when I was a student, John had done the funeral for this person's first wife or husband, and as a joke, I said, "You wouldn't have to remember what you'd said sort of 20 years previously." "Let me see," he said, and he got the sermon there within probably 20 seconds because he got a box file there. This was long before you could have it all on computers. And he was so organized. He got everything there and he could remember everything and he could turn up these facts. He was so well ordered and he was so efficient, but he's also so lovely. And I'm so delighted that we should start this series of, it's headed as adult education, but it's more than that. It's really exploring through individuals the substance and the culture of liberal Judaism as we celebrate our 120th year. And so, Charles, thanks for your wonderful presentation. David Littman up there in Nottingham, a reminder that John had an influence on so many congregations throughout the movement. I could go through the list of the people I see here and so many people from the past, but particularly I would like to thank Jane Rayner for being here tonight and for sharing her husband with us. I know that my wife Sharon often says that sort of she shares. I have to share her, that I share her together with liberal Judaism. But I know that you had such a happy marriage. He was a wonderful husband and father, but he was also an inspiration that makes liberal Judaism what it is as we celebrate our 120th anniversary.
Charles, thank you so very, very much this evening, and for everybody who's participated. We look forward to seeing you next week, and until then, have a very good week.